The bench was cold enough to bite through fabric. But the woman sitting on it wasn't shivering from the weather anymore. She was shivering from something deeper. The particular cold that comes from being looked at by hundreds of people and seen by none of them. Her hands wrapped around nothing trembled, not from hunger alone, but from a truth she was only beginning to understand. Just a few feet away, a man in worn work boots stood frozen, staring at a container of food that represented the last dollars he had in the world. He had a 6-year-old son waiting at home and a promise to a dead wife still ringing in his ears. In 3 seconds, he would make a decision that cost him everything he had left to give. In 3 months, that decision would rewrite the fate of thousands of people neither of them had ever met. What happened over the next few hours would change both of their lives forever. Before we begin, if you believe kindness, humility, and second chances can change the world, please take a moment to like this video, comment where you're watching from, share this story with someone who needs inspiration today, and subscribe to the Aura Fables for more unforgettable stories. 3 weeks earlier, in the glass tower that dominated the Chicago skyline, Eleanor Whitfield sat at the head of a boardroom table longer than most people's living rooms. She was 52 years old, sharp-eyed, and immaculately composed. The kind of woman whose silence could end a career faster than her words. She had built Whitfield Dynamics from a single warehouse into a logistics empire worth $11 billion. And in doing so, she had learned to see people the way she saw spreadsheets, as numbers that either performed or didn't. She judged competence by posture, by the cut of a suit, by the firmness of a handshake. She had not set foot on a warehouse floor in over a decade. To Eleanor, the workers beneath her were an abstraction, a line item labeled labor costs. Across the city, in a modest 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, Sal Romano was folding his son's small shirts into a drawer. Sal was 39, broad-shouldered, with hands that had once drafted structural blueprints for a mid-sized engineering firm and now spent their days lifting freight onto a warehouse conveyor belt. He had not always been an ordinary laborer. Before life rearranged itself around grief, Sal had been a rising structural engineer, the kind of man who solved problems other men called impossible. But when his wife Gina was diagnosed with an aggressive illness, he had walked away from a career that demanded 60-hour weeks, choosing instead a steady, undemanding warehouse shift that let him be home every evening to hold her hand and later to hold his son. Gina passed away 2 years ago. Since then, Sal's entire world had narrowed to a single purpose: raising Nico, his 6-year-old boy, with the same quiet steadiness his wife would have wanted. He never spoke of the career he had given up. He never complained about the calluses that had replaced the precision of his old drafting hands. He simply worked, came home, made dinner, and told Nico bedtime stories until the boy's eyes finally closed. Sal was the kind of man the world had stopped noticing. Dependable, dressed down, unremarkable on the surface, and carrying beneath that surface a weight of sacrifice no spreadsheet could ever capture. Neither Eleanor nor Sal knew the other existed. But fate, it turns out, has its own quiet architecture, and it was already drawing them together. The morning everything changed began with catastrophe. A multi-billion-dollar merger between Whitfield Dynamics and an overseas shipping conglomerate was set to close within 72 hours, and the entire agreement hinged on a single, unresolved problem: the structural integrity of Whitfield's newest automated distribution hub, a facility that had cost $900 million to build. An emergency inspection had uncovered stress fractures in the support framework, and if the facility failed certification, the merger would collapse along with 2,000 jobs. Eleanor stood in the middle of the warehouse floor, surrounded by a small army of consultants in tailored suits, all of them talking over one another, all of them terrified, none of them offering an actual solution. The lead structural consultant, a man named Bradford Ainsley, who charged $800 an hour, insisted the facility would need to be shut down for months of retrofitting, a delay that would kill the deal entirely. Voices rose. Blame was hurled. Eleanor's face had gone pale with the particular fury of a woman watching everything she'd built teeter on the edge of collapse. Off to the side, largely invisible in his grey uniform, Sal stood with a clipboard, having been pulled from his shift to help clear the floor for the inspection team. He said nothing, but his eyes moved differently than everyone else's in that room. Where the consultants saw panic, Sal saw load distribution. Where they saw a crisis requiring months, Sal saw a miscalculation in the original support beam specifications, the kind of error he used to catch in his sleep back when structural math had been his entire life. He shifted his weight, cleared his throat, and said nothing further, unsure if a warehouse worker in a stained uniform had any right to speak in a room full of executives. Old instinct told him to stay silent, but another voice, quieter and more insistent, reminded him that silence had never once solved a problem in his life. "Excuse me," Sal said. The room did not immediately turn. A man in coveralls speaking up in a boardroom crisis was, to most of them, simply background noise. But Eleanor, scanning the room for anyone with an actual answer, turned toward the sound of his voice. "You have something to add?" she asked, her tone edged with impatience. Sal walked forward, and for the first time in 2 years, something of his old self returned to his spine. "Your support beams aren't undersized," he said. "They're misaligned. Whoever ran the load calculations used a static distribution model instead of a dynamic one. Under constant conveyor vibration, the stress concentrates at the joints, not the beams themselves. You don't need months of retrofitting. You need cross-bracing reinforcement at 11 specific joints. I could mark them in under an hour." Silence swallowed the room whole. Bradford Ainsley scoffed, opening his mouth to dismiss him, but Eleanor raised a hand. "How would you know that?" Sal met her eyes, steady and unashamed. "Because before I worked here, I was a structural engineer for 9 years. I designed distribution facilities twice this size. I gave it up when my wife got sick. I needed a job that let me be home for my son." The room did not move. Eleanor's expression shifted from disbelief to something rawer, something that looked almost like recognition. She had spent the last 3 weeks disguised on the streets of this very city, sitting on a frozen park bench, invisible to everyone who passed her. Everyone except one exhausted, grieving stranger who had split his last meal in half and handed it to her without asking a single question about who she was or what she could do for him. She stepped closer, studying his face, and her breath caught. "Sal," she whispered. "It's you." Sal's mouth fell open. The freezing woman from the bench, the one he'd worried about for weeks, the one he'd hoped had found somewhere warm, was standing in front of him in a tailored blazer, the owner of the entire company. Eleanor turned to her stunned executive team. "This man," she said, her voice trembling with an emotion $11 billion had never once bought her, "solved in 90 seconds what your entire consulting team couldn't solve in 3 days. And 3 weeks ago, when I had nothing, when I was cold and hungry and invisible to every single person who calls himself successful in this city, he was the only human being who stopped." At that moment, the side door opened and Nico walked in, holding the hand of a security guard who'd been asked to bring him from the daycare down the street. The boy scanned the room until he found his father standing at its center. And when the executives, the same ones who, moments earlier, had ignored Sal entirely, rose to their feet in a spontaneous, thunderous standing ovation, Nico's small hands came together too, clapping as hard as he could, tears sliding down his cheeks at the sight of his father finally being seen. Bradford Ainsley was the first to approach Sal afterward, extending a hand and offering an apology that came from somewhere far deeper than professional courtesy. Eleanor personally reinstated Sal as head structural engineer, not out of pity, but because she said plainly that a man who gives everything when he has nothing is exactly the kind of character she should have been building her company around all along. Sal accepted the position on one condition, that Eleanor raise wages and expand healthcare for every warehouse worker on that floor. The invisible people who kept the empire running and had never once been thanked for it. She agreed before he finished the sentence. Months later, Sal stood in that same warehouse, no longer invisible, teaching young engineers the very calculations that had once cost him his career, and in the end, quietly saved it. He never forgot the bench, or the cold, or the woman who had needed nothing more than to be seen. True greatness, it turns out, was never measured by titles or tailored suits. It was measured by character, by what a person chooses to give when giving costs them everything they have left. Every person passing you on the street is carrying a battle you cannot see. And sometimes the only thing standing between despair and redemption is a stranger willing to stop, sit down, and share what little they have.